Won't be.
Hmm.
Yes, sir. The meeting is being recorded.
Thank you, Dev Doctor, for being the host for the evening. Uh, Good evening, everyone present here. Today, we are here hosting the 10th edition of there's some echo. The 10th edition of our Saturday with a Scholar, and it has been quite a journey. Thank you, Team Desnu, and all our young student members for being a part of this journey. Wonderful journey. Today, as we embark on the 10th episode of our Saturday with the Scholar, we are delighted to have with us Professor Debashis Bandyopadhyay, who is currently a professor of English at Rabindra Bharati University. Formerly, he had taught in Vidyasagar University, Banaras Hindu University, Presidency University, among several other institutions of higher education in India and abroad. As a Fulbright scholar, he pursued research and taught at California State University, Fresno, California in the United States during 2007 and 8. Supported by the Charles Wallace Fellowship, he conducted postdoctoral research at St. Anthony's College, Oxford University, United Kingdom in 2011 and 12. As an international visiting professor, he also taught at the University of Guanajuato in Salamanca, Mexico during the session 2019-2020. He is widely published in India and abroad. Among his several books, the work entitled Locating the Anglo-Indian Self in Ruskin Bond, a post-colonial review brought out by Anthem Press from New York, was shortlisted by Washington Higher Education Chronicle. His research interests include psychoanalysis and literature, the arts and human well-being, and poetry in performance. Thank you so much, sir, for joining us today. And without much delay, we look forward to hearing you. Sir, we would request you to start.
Thank you, Professor Roy Chaudhary. Thank you, Professor Dhor. Thank you, Devdatta. And thanks to the host who have created this excellent opportunity to meet virtually on a fine Saturday evening. With this, we are going to end the week on a very, very positive note so that you can begin the next week with a new fervor. Now, I was requested to speak on Freud, Lacan, and Zizek. Most of you must have heard of Sigmund Freud, especially those who are studying cultural studies or English literature, or those who belong to several other disciplines, because Freud had brought in a new paradigm shift in understanding human minds and especially human behavior, which is also required to understand character sketches in literary texts, and also the different kinds of actions in cultural scenarios. Especially because Freud had himself was a psychiatrist who later on veered into psychoanalysis and started probing into the deeper unconscious of the human psyche, and came to an understanding that 90% of what we actually do and the way in which we behave are induced by the unconscious processes of the mind, the unconscious dynamics of the psychological energy store that we have. That is why sometimes when we feel that we are conscious of what we are doing, we don't know how the unconscious is betraying us at every moment. Later on, he is very apt disciple of the 20th century, a French disciple of his called Jacques Lacan, who used this particular clinical notion of the unconscious in understanding literary texts, because he blended the notion of unconscious with the understanding of linguistic signifiers. especially after the work of Ferdinand de Saussure. Now, Lacan and Freud, if they are read together or understood together, it would actually give you a new instrument to understand or decipher texts. And you can ensure the fact that texts become plural and at the same time disavow the capitalist projects of turning down texts into a singular metaphors so that they can profit by that. So it is more a sort of a socio-economic venture and at the same time a new radical shift from older philological understanding of human affairs or the importance of texts. Before coming to Zizek, I'll be first referring to the basic rudiments of Freudian understanding of how the psyche works, and then move on to Lacan, and then refer to Slavoj Zizek, who is still living. Slavoj Zizek, who is a Slovenian psychoanalyst, and again a very important and an apt disciple of Lacan and Sigmund Freud. Zizek gave a new dimension to the entire discourse of psychoanalysis. Who is still living. I will engage with Zizek a little later after beginning with Freud. Now, what is this notion of Freud's unconscious? I will begin with a particular text of Freud's, which is known as Beyond the Pleasure Principle. Beyond the pleasure principle, in fact, human beings always wish to do something which maximizes his sense of pleasure. We always look forward to gaining more and more pleasure. We are pleasure hunters. Consciously or unconsciously, we do the same thing. But how does Freud define pleasure? What is pleasure? If we always wish to look forward to pleasure, then why do we bring about different kinds of apparently tormenting things upon us and at the same time inflicting torment upon others? Do these particular actions also stimulate pleasure within us? Is a very important question with which we are going to begin. If we try to maximize pleasure, then what is the definition of pleasure? Somebody, if you see somebody trying to cut his veins in order to commit suicide or just let off blood, do you think that particular action is causing him pain or pleasure? You would simply say that this person is mad. Somebody is preparing himself to jump in front of a running metro to commit suicide. This particular suicidal tendency is there within us, and you would say that human beings have become frustrated enough. That is why they have been mad and prone to annihilate themselves. But this notion of annihilation works simultaneously within this particular notion of quote-unquote pleasure. So pain and pleasure is a sort of a dynamics work together. And you never know when your desire for pleasure converts into your desire for pain and vice versa. This is a new dimension which had been opened up by Freud's interpretation of what pleasure is in this particular discourse called Beyond the Pleasure Principle. So here I will actually merge the notion of Freud with the three psychic phases of Jacques Lacan in order to move from one particular text to another text. I would actually take a freedom, because if I move from one text and then move into another text, it would take a lot of time. So in order to interpret a particular scenario, a particular action, a particular attitude, Lacan would actually supplement or complement our ideas. Let us see how. Lacan speaks about three phases of our growing psyche. And the natal state, from the birth to the 6 months of our age, is the age of the imaginary. Then we enter into a state called the symbolic. And thirdly, we might or we might not enter into a state called the real with a capital R. All these three psychic states, the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real, are spelt with a capital first letter. So the real that Lacan is speaking of is not the quotidian real that we generally speak of when with a small r. So the very notion of reality and Lacanian real is different. Lacan does not spell out elaborately upon the notion of the real, but he very much speaks about the notion of the imaginary and the symbolic. The imaginary is a state of the psyche of the infant from the birth to the 6 months or 18 months of its age. It can be an extended imaginary state of condition. Within the imaginary state of condition is a state called the mirror state. Although these particular terms and nomenclatures might appear to be quite hard sounding, let me, for the sake of understanding it better, give you practical or concrete examples of what these particular stages are. Then only you can come back to the notion of the pleasure principle once more to understand what it is actually. If you have children at home, you must have seen a child who does not know how to walk, who is yet not a toddler, uh, who cannot coordinate its body physical motilities. If you have seen that particular child coming and standing with the help of the wood in a mirror or a support in a mirror, playing with its own image in the mirror, this is a common incident that you might have seen anywhere if you have an infant at home, playing with its own self in the mirror. What the child is actually doing is, according to Freud, at the same time being vindicated by Lacan, is the child is simply playing with its own mirror image. This mirror image is something that the child doesn't understand. The child only misrecognizes, which according to Lacan's French is called méconnaissance. Méconnaissance means misrecognition of itself in the mirror image. It thinks that I am that particular self that I see in the mirror. But at the same time, the child does not only misrecognizes his actual self in the mirror as a virtual self, but at the same time misrecognizes its mother in the mirror image, because he understands that just as my mother has 2 eyes, my mother has 2 hands, my mother has 2 legs, I have the same proportions or the same symmetry like my mother. So I am as whole, W-H-O-L-E, whole, as my mother is by looking at the mirror. So two misrecognitions actually work in the child at this moment. The his extended self in the mirror image he considers to be himself, and at the same time he misidentifies itself as the mother in the mirror image. But this is not what he is. It is a futuristic self that he actually sees. Futuristic, why? Because he has not become whole. He soon realizes that he is not a whole. Once it leaves the mirror and tries to walk, it falls down. At the very moment that it falls down away from the mirror, the child realizes that I am not that misrecognized self, that particular self that I saw in the mirror, if it is I and my mother, but that I have not yet become, because I am falling down, my mother doesn't fall down. No sooner does the child falls down than the child cries out for help, cries out because the child is in pain. And if the mother had been around, the mother can be a biological mother, the mother can be a person performing the role of a mother, which Lacan calls the motherer, with an ER at the end. Now the mother or the motherer comes running in to help the child. Oh, my child, you have fallen down. And with the help of the mother, the child stands up again. So the mother acts like a crutch to the child. The mother's presence at that moment of the child's falling down causes or creates a sense of pleasure to the child because it returns back to the mother. This is a libidinal drive that we almost all know in the form taking place, which we know as the Oedipal complex. I'm not getting into the Oedipal complex, but this is a inlaid complex that we all human beings, especially the male, have. But at the infant state, the notion of the male and the female do not work in the way in which the gender divide works after the month of 18, according to clinical psychology, according to Freud. So now try to understand that particular moment, the condition of the child at that moment. Why does the child cry? Does the child hurt itself when it falls down? Not exactly. The child hurts its psyche at the moment when it falls down rather than hurting himself physically. It hurts its psyche because it cannot communicate with its mirror image any longer. What he thought to be himself in the mirror image, that particular thought, that particular recognition is now fractured once it falls down, because it is not a whole, it is not like the mother. That causes its pain. It might have caused a physical pain as well, but that is not very important. But then if it cries, if it falls down and suffers from a psychological and a physical pain, it also ensures the presence of the mother. And no sooner does the mother comes, it starts smiling. So what do you think? The child wishes to fall down, or the child really abhors or despises this particular condition of falling down? Freud and Lacan both conform at this moment, saying, yes, the child wishes to fall down in spite of the psychic trauma that it suffers. Again, I am saying it suffers a psychic trauma because it cannot communicate with its mirror image any longer, because it has fallen down and it is not a whole. But then it, in spite of the pain, it wishes to suffer that pain again, because that particular pain if it hadn't happened to it, it wouldn't have ensured the presence of the mother. So that painful condition makes the mother's presence possible. So it wishes to hurt itself once more. If you have a pen and a paper in front of you, I can draw an equation out of this entire story or this particular condition. You can write in your paper C with a capital C plus M. M stands for mother. C stands for child. C plus M, the mother, is equal to W. W means a whole. W is the whole of the mirror image that the child misrecognized at the very beginning of the mirror image. C plus M. Now, once the child falls down, it requests the mother to get back or restore that mirror image of wholeness. With the help of the mother as a crutch, it stands up again and restores his own self of wholeness. That's why I have written this equation as C plus M is equal to whole. Now, in common algebra or arithmetical process, therefore C is equal to W minus M. You take the M on the other side of the right side of the equation, C becomes W minus M. W minus M means whole minus the mother. Therefore, C is equal to a fragment. You take anything out of an unity, that is a whole, you take anything out of a whole, it becomes a fragment, isn't it? So C is equal to fragment. What does this equation that we have come to really metaphorizes, signifies? It is not a plain equation. It is a state of mind. It is a state of mind that is always already repressed within us, because all of us have a child within us. A C is equal to F is a state of mind which tells us that the child within us always wishes to fragment itself. And the desire to fragment one's own self is that particular desire to kill one's own self, annihilate one's own self. Metaphorically, it means the child's desire to get back to its mother. That means the oceanic condition, that is the mother's womb. The place from where a child is born, the mother's womb, is the place to where the child wishes to get back to. So your desire to get back to that oceanic state of condition can have two different implications. One implication is that the child is despising this particular world and wants to annihilate oneself, which is the state of the desire for fragmentation, number one. Number two, the returning back to the oceanic state of condition is a desire to get back to the pre-egoic state of condition. Now I am bringing in yet another very important psychological faculty, which is called the ego. Now, what is an ego? I will come back to that particular condition of the child C is equal to F within a trice. Let me just digress a little and refer to what this ego is and how it is born. If you have watched children again at home, when the child is not conscious about the external world and does not know how to make a difference between itself and the rest of the world, even if a tiger passes by, the child would have a proclivity of entering its hand into the mouth of the tiger. If a dog passes by, it would simply try to unbend its tail, because it does not make a difference between itself and the rest of the world. Those who are students of literature here might understand it with a better metaphor. For example, Wordsworth in his Immortality Ode said that when you were a child, you were just beside the sea, but as you grow old, you are moving farther inland, where you require probity, reflection, to understand that there is a presence of a sea. But as a child, you are almost on the side of a sea. Although you are not in a side of a sea, the sea here is a metaphor, means the oceanic state of condition. You can feel by all your sensory data. You don't require any philosophical reflection to understand that there is an oceanic condition. That means you are in tune with the entire world. But as you grow old, means once you enter into the egoic state of condition, you do not understand that you are a part of the world anymore. You create a sort of a wall between yourself and the rest of the universe. That is exactly what the ego is. And the ego, which we did not refer to at the mirror stage, I am now referring it to you now, is the moment once the child understands itself in the mirror reflection, it understands that it is growing an ego within itself. Although I am saying understanding, the child remains unconscious about the very notion of the growth of the ego in itself. It starts making a difference between itself and the other. The other is the mirror image at this moment. Although it wishes to identify with the mirror image, it's falling down, says that no, I am not the mirror image, so my extended self was my other. So the growth of the notion of the self and the other takes place with the birth of the ego within the child. And this ego constantly goes on bolstering, consolidating itself as we grow up. So the ego is in one way a faculty that makes a difference between the self and the rest of the universe, the other. And at the same time, the ego is a very significant falsifier or a false connector. We will come to the second role of the ego a little later, but most of you must have heard of the connection between the id ego and the superego from a Freudian point of view. The id is our basic natural desire to do a particular work, to satisfy our desires. The superego is something internalized within our psyche of the proscriptions or the prohibitions of a civil code of conduct that is internalized within our psyche. So id wishes to perform its desire. The superego, as an internalized law, proscribes or prohibits the id to perform its own desires. So this particular conflict between the id and the superego, in most of the cases, are mediated by the ego. The ego plays a very, very deceptive role at that moment, which we will come to when we will be speaking more about the notion of violence, or especially how this notion of self-annihilation turns out into a violent tendency within human beings, which we all always have within us. It is civil society that makes us restrict this particular violent tendency within ourselves. Now, this particular notion of the birth of the ego creates a state of a post-egoic conception. The pre-egoic conception was an oceanic state of condition. As I referred to, C is equal to F might have two very important implications. One is a desire to annihilate oneself and get back to the umbic state of condition, the oceanic state of condition. If you annihilate yourself, again you get back to the oceanic state of the condition from where you were born. It is a biological metaphor that you were born from the mother's womb. Otherwise, you are a part of the entire universe. You want to get back to that particular universe. So you want to get back to the pre-egoic state of condition. For example, once the ego is born and the child starts to make a difference between itself and the other, all notions of selfish ideas start growing within us, and we become basically selfish. But this particular egoistic notion of selfishness is a very plastic or a very elastic state of condition. In literature, it is possible for us to understand, those who are postgraduate students, I am basically speaking to the students over here, must be remembering the famous definition of Coleridge's idea of the primary imagination in the 13th book of the Biographia Literaria. If you have not read it, just go back and read it, what Coleridge means by the primary imagination. Coleridge says that, I'm just changing the words and making it more reductive for you to understand. Coleridge says by primary imagination that it is a reputation in the finite mind of the infinite I am. This particular definition, this particular discourse can be interpreted from a psychological point of view. Repetition in the finite mind, the infinite I am. What is this infinite I am? Freud would have said that this infinite I am is the sensibility of the pre-egoic psyche. The pre-egoic state of mind where the child cannot make any difference between itself and the entire universe. That particular condition can be reached again when great saints, great poets and visionaries say that suddenly we had an epiphanic state of mind, epiphanic condition where I completely communicate or understand that there is no difference between myself and the rest of the universe. That infinite notion from a psychological or a Freudian point of view is known as the infinite I am. That is a state of condition in the pre-egoic state where the ego is not born and the child cannot make a difference between itself and the rest of the world. But then what does the first part of the definition of primary imagination means, where Cody says, repetition in the finite mind of the infinite I am. This infinite self is the egoic state of condition, where you are in a state of finitude. That means you are narrowed down within your own self, the finite state of condition. But that does not mean that your mind is inelastic. That does not mean that at any point of time you cannot expand the horizons of yourself to incorporate or encompass the entire world. That's what Freud is pointing out in yet another very important essay of his at the beginning of it, which is called Civilization and Its Discontents, where he says, he begins the entire essay. It's a brilliant essay. You can go back and read it. He says, he begins the essay like this, that when I wrote my essay called The Future of Illusions, I sent it to a scholar named Romarola. You must have heard of Romarola. So Freud says that I sent my essay called The Future of Illusions to Romarola for response. Romarola read the entire essay, where for the first time Freud uses the term called oceanic, and responded back to Freud in a letter saying that Freud, you refer to the term oceanic, but the way in which you psychoanalytically interpret the term oceanic is incomprehensible to me at this moment. But I can feel what you mean by the term oceanic because my studies in Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda had gave me an understanding of the epiphanic state of condition in which the oceanic self can be realized. But that is for a very temporarily very short period of time when I really communicate in that state of condition with the rest of the universe. So Romarola's understanding of Swamiji and Ramakrishna gave him a sort of an idea about the oceanic, which is something that Freud takes up in his next work called Civilization and Its Discontents, and he goes on introducing, saying that what Romarola means as the oceanic is actually the pre-egoic state of mind, which the egoic state of mind retains as a remainder, as a remnant of the pre-egoic state. That means once in the mirror state of condition, the ego is born within the child, and the child starts differentiating between the self and the rest of the universe, does not mean completely that it had completely forgotten the pre-egoic state of condition, or the pre-egoic state of condition is completely done away with. It remains repressed within the psyche, and that is what is known as the remnant of the pre-egoic state. That is why it is possible for us at any moment of time, in a very opportune and a convenient moment of time, to repeat the pre-egoic state of the oceanic, the infinite I am in the finite, in the egoic state of condition. That is why you always understand that the self that you think is different from the rest of the universe is an elastic self, which can broaden its horizon and continuously expand in order to unite the entire world as its fraternity. This pre-egoic state of condition actually works at the moment when the child falls down. But C is equal to F is a state of condition which works in these two directions. Now, let us come to the second state of condition, of the psyche's development from a Lacanian point of view. The second state is called the symbolic state with a capital S. So the mirror state of condition, where we have come to an equation called C is equal to F, that state of condition now is addressed by the second state of psychic condition called the symbolic state. The symbolic state is the state in which a child is initiated into the domain of, or the realm of, language. When the child is weaned, for example, in the famous metaphysical poem by John Donne called The Good Morrow, if you remember, in the first paragraph, John Donne says, "Were we not weaned till then, but sucked on country pleasures childishly?" He refers to his former love as a state of non-weaning. What he actually means is he was innocent about the kind of physical love that he was engaged in with his lover, but now that he is initiated to normal diet and he is detached from its mother, it understands what real love is. So the state of weaning is a state of detachment of the child from its mother, which is a very painful state of condition. So when the child cries for his mother, the mother says no. Again, the child cries for the mother says no. So the mother feeds the child with the father's language. No is a father's language. That means the child says that, no, child, the father is for me and you are not for me, or I am not for you. You have to get initiated into normalcy. And that is the civil code of conduct that all human beings have to actually graduate into in their development as human beings. Otherwise, we cannot grow up into a civil state of condition any longer. But this particular transformation or transition, again, is another state of pain for the child. This entry into the world of language is called the entry into the symbolic, which coincides with the child's being weaned and get familiarized with normal diet. Let me digress again and come back to what we were saying by referring to a particular game that Freud refers to in his Beyond the Pleasure principle, which is known as the Faute-d'art game. The Faute-d'art game is something of a case study that Freud himself makes by observing his own grandchild playing on a perambulator. The mother was around. Freud was smoking a cigar and was thinking, contemplating things, when he found that once the mother leaves the child starts crying. And after having cried for a few seconds, when the child finds that the mother is not returning, the child stops crying, picks up a reel of wool, a ball of wool lying in front of the child, and starts throwing that particular ball. Fortunately, a string of the wool gets tied up with on his forefinger. So the ball of wool vanishes outside the door once it throws the ball. And once the ball vanishes, the child's face turns into a grimace, and the child calls out, visually upset and tormented and traumatized, saying, "Fort!" Then it starts tugging at that particular end of the string. The ball starts rotating and it reappears at the door once more. And once the ball reappears, the child's face beams into a smile, and with evident pleasure, the child cries out, "Da!" Freud immediately understands what this entire thing the child is doing. But what strikes Freud is that if the disappearance of the ball is creating a sense of pain in the child and the child is traumatized, the child repeats that particular game once again. Once the ball returns back to it, the child throws the ball again. Again, the ball vanishes and the child becomes upset and the child calls out, "Fort!" Again, he tugs at the ball reappears and his face beams into laughter and he says, "Da." So the disappearance causes pain, the reappearance causes pleasure. This is what the child is playing now in the absence of the mother. So the Freud's interpretation is this, that in the absence of the mother, that particular ball becomes the replacement or the supplantation of the mother. So the toy, the children playing with toy is simply the metaphors for the mother. So the child, the mother is disappearing outside the door, causes the child to torment. The reappearance of the ball is the reappearance of the mother, which makes the child pleased and happy. But why is the child repeating something which is causing pain to him, which is almost like C is equal to F state of condition, which the child constantly wants to work on, that we always constantly want to work on? Because the child was trying to master that particular experience of living without the mother. It is trying to master it. It is trying to acclimatize itself with this absence of the mother, by this constant repetition. This is called the return of the repressed. That constantly happens within us in clinical psychology. The repressed comes tormenting us at any moment, and you require a psychoanalyst to understand what this repressed is that you require to get cured. I'm not getting into clinical psychology at this moment. That one thing is quite clear, that this particular ball is a supplantation of the mother, and this particular repetition of pleasure and pain is something that constantly working within us, and the child is doing that with the help of a symbol. This particular ball of wool can be language as well. This ball of wool can be institutions of civilization as well. So it is almost like our entry into the symbolic with a capital S is the symbolic or the institutions telling us that you cannot get back to your libidinal self anymore. In order to live a civilized life, you have to repress your libidinal desires. You cannot annihilate yourself, but you can only channelize your natural libidinal desires into symbolic states of conditions. And this symbolic state of, one of the major symbolic state of condition is language. But then remember, language does not give you the same satisfaction that the satisfaction or fulfillment of your libidinal desire in a natural manner would provide you with. Did you get my point? That is why T.S. Eliot, in his famous essay, said, lips that cannot kiss sing. Tell me, what did I say? Lips that cannot kiss sing. What does Eliot mean? The normal action of the lips is kissing. But since in a civil state of condition, it is not possible for a subject to go on kissing in a promiscuous manner, you simply tame your desire for kissing and translate that particular desire or channelize that desire into an inhibitory state of condition, which is singing about kissing, creating a romantic song or a romantic poem for that matter. So you are doing that by means of language. That is why even in linguistics, those who know linguistics would understand that language is said to be an overlaid activity of the lips. This is the first thing that Roman Jakobson's notion of linguistics teaches us. You are quite surprised to understand this. You hear it now, that speaking is an overlaid activity of the lips. This is the first thing that linguistics tells us. That is exactly what T.S. Eliot was saying. See, you are simply sublimating or inhibiting your natural desire into a symbolic state of condition. You are trying to adjust it in a symbolic state of condition. From this particular state of adjustment is born two other very important principles that Freud points out in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, which is called the pleasure principle and the reality principle. Suppose, I'm constantly giving you concrete examples for your understanding. Suppose you have a libidinal energy of 1,000 calories and you require, and the greatest satisfaction that you gain out of this particular libidinal energy is complete expenditure of 1,000 calories of libidinal energy in a natural manner. But in a civilized state of condition, you cannot go about doing that. You require to repress, at least in terms of state, in terms of condition, in terms of spaces. You can satisfy 600 calories in America in a downtown American state space. Whereas in a conservative Indian village, you can satisfy only 200 calories in a natural manner. What happens to the 800 calories of libidinal energy? You have to sublimate it, channelize it in an inhibitory process. What are the different ways of channelizing it? Suppose think that I am speaking here. What I am doing as a teacher, I am simply channelizing my libidinal energy into a acceptable civil mode of channelization. A doctor goes to perform a surgery, the doctor is channelizing his libidinal energy into that particular action. But the pleasure principle says that you require to fulfill 1,000 calories in a natural way. The reality principle says, no, you cannot do that in a natural manner. 200 calories or 400 calories you can satisfy in a natural manner. The rest of the 600 calories you require to sublimate or inhibit and translate it into an inhibitory or a sublimatory manner. The amount of satisfaction or the degree of satisfaction that you will gain in a reality principle condition is much less than the degree of satisfaction that you will gain from a pleasure principle condition. That means by satisfying your libidinal energy in a natural manner, the highest amount of pleasure you will gain. So there is a difference in the degree of pleasure in the reality principle. If you minus this particular degree of pleasure from the pleasure principle's degree of pleasure, there is a deficit that you will get. What happens to this deficit? This deficit constantly gets repressed and frustrated within us. If only by a sublimatory manner we can completely transcend this particular state of frustration. The yogis can do that, the saints can do that, and even human beings can do that, but then out of a particular kind of a law. For example, Freud points out in yet another discourse, saying that when the Bible taught the Christians, love thy neighbor as thyself, do you think that the Bible did not find it imperative to teach it? Why did the Bible require to teach it from the altar? Because that is not a normal thing. Human beings cannot love their neighbor as themselves. This is the most impossible thing on earth. That is why, in order to live a civilized life, you require to have a canonical, sacramental text like the Bible to preach it from the altar, so much so that you cannot interrogate the Bible and you abide by the law. Any law in that manner is a sort of a frustration to you. It constantly restricts your libidinal self. So you grow on, you have to love other, that is why you are loving other. Now, if you take these two particular conditions together, this particular symbolic state of frustration in which language is constantly frustrating us, Lacan has yet another particular notion about this idea of frustration within language. That is why he says language is structured like the unconscious and vice versa, and the unconscious is structured like a language. And he says that a subject is constructed by language, and at the same time a subject is deconstructed or alienated by language. So the language that you are speaking in order to express your desires, your intentions, the communications that you are making is half fulfilling your desire. It cannot completely fulfill your desire. That is why Lacan creates a sign called a capital S and puts a bar through that capital S. He creates a full S as a subject and puts a bar, cuts that particular S through the middle. Means the subject is created by language and at the same time alienated by language. It is almost like you are saying to a friend, I love you, and then going back home, repenting for what you have said. Perhaps you wanted to say something more than what this particular signifier love contains, or perhaps you wanted to say something less. But in the absence or in the inadequacy of because of the inadequacy of language, you are not capable of saying what you wanted to say. So your thoughts, once translated into language, alienates you constantly. So symbolic is a state of condition. Symbolic can also work in terms of the institutions. It is the big other from a Zizekian point of view. Here I will enter into the premise of what do you call Zizek to make this particular notion of the symbolic understandable more. Suppose you were walking down the street, a beautiful person is coming from the other side, and most possibly a person of the other gender in a heteronormative state of condition, and that particular person does a grimace to you, that immediately at that moment your entire self of the self will be fractured into smithereens. You'd be simply traumatized, although you don't know that particular person. Why is this? Because when you looked at that particular person, that particular beauty, you had looked at the person with a sense of desire. But when that particular person returns your desire with a grimace, with a twist of face, you understand that person negates you, does not acknowledge you. There are two others actually working in this correspondence, in this reciprocation. One is the small other from a Zizekian point of view. The other is called the big other. The small other is your desire for that beauty. The big other is your desire for that particular beauty's desire for you. This is actually inflected by the notion of a gaze, the Lacanian notion of a gaze, interpreted by Slavoj Zizek, the Slovenian interpreter. Now, what does this particular gaze in a broader socialistic institution or a social phenomenon known as? That means this gaze, the other's gaze that requests to acknowledge you, is actually the big other, which is metaphorized, although in our story as the beautiful other woman coming from the other side is not actually a beautiful woman, is actually the institutions which you enter into. Suppose you go to Sister Nivedita University, but if Sister Nivedita University does not recognize you, your desire to enter into the portals of that university would be banished, isn't it? So it is not only your desire to belong to SNU that matters, which is the little other, but Sister Nivedita University's desire to acknowledge you is something that you desire too. That is the big other. That means, suppose you are a driver. You can drive a car very well, but then you do not have a driving license. Would you go about getting a job as a driver in any institution? You won't be able to do that because the institution requests to recognize you with a driving license. That is the big other. That is the state of the symbolic. Unless it does that, you are not recognized. This particular big other can do harm to you. This is the symbolic state of condition that constantly repudiates you, reprimands you, represses you constantly because you cannot naturally fulfill yourself, but you have to conform to the law of this particular big other in order to adjust and fit into the state of the big other. So the child in the state of the big other constantly wants to return back to its C is equal to F state of condition, out of which the very notion of violence grows within ourselves, within this particular state of frustration. I will introduce here two very important drives. Once I have spoken about the notion of the small other, big other, the notion of the C is equal to F, I will now enter into two very important Freudian drives, which again you must have come to know. You have heard of that in your literature classes, cultural studies classes. One is called the desire for self-preservation, which is known as eros. The other is called the desire for self-annihilation, which is the C is equal to F state of condition, called thanatos or death drive. Now, each and every human being, because we have already begun with the notion of C is equal to F, and if you think that that is a true state, very important state of condition, the child always wishes to get back to its mother. That is why it wants to fall down. It wants to inflict pain upon itself. For example, Andrew Marvell, because most of you are literature students, let me take the liberty of giving you yet another example from Andrew Marvell's famous poem To His Coy Mistress, where the poem ends with the very notion of the lover telling his beloved, exhorting his beloved to unite physically, and he conjures up the image of love making. And he also refers to that lovemaking as one of the most secular images of life that tells us that pain and pleasure simultaneously cohere in one particular action. You never know how pain transforms into pleasure and pleasure transforms into pain. And one of the secular ways of understanding is lovemaking. This can be extended into other different features and phases of life. In every condition, you are actually moving into a state of aporia, to use a Derridian term, where your pain is translating into pleasure and pleasure into pain. So these two drives, the drive for pleasure and the drive for pain, the drive for pleasure is known as eros, the drive for pain is called thanatos. And this thanatos is always directed at your own self, because C is equal to F. If you have understood C is equal to F correctly, you understand that this drive for self-annihilation or this desire for pain is always directed at your own self, which is self-reflexive. But then you have a desire for eros. You want to preserve yourself, like you want to preserve your mirror image. You want to preserve yourself. But then if thanatic drive or thanatic energy exceeds your erotic energy, you will soon become suicidal. That is why the next time, after hearing what I am saying, next time you see a person suicidal, you will understand that particular suicidal state of condition also inheres within us at every moment. But normative state of conditions does not allow us into that existential crisis of committing suicide. That is why no person who commits suicide or is prepared to commit suicide can be called mad. It is a natural tendency within us, because the thanatic drive constantly works within us, because now you are no ordinary students. Now you understand a little bit of the rudiments of psychology, and you understand C is equal to F is a state of condition always already inherent within us. Now, what happens to this thanatic drive? Then how? The question now, which all your minds are bristling with, is how can we get rid of this thanatic drive? Or how is this thanatic drive overwhelmed by the erotic drive? How do we go about doing it? You can do it by sublimation. You can do it by channelizing your thanatic drive, which is an energy, by spending it in different ways. For example, the children are often taken to a counselor, a psychoanalytic or a psychologist, a counselor, a psychiatric counselor. And the parents tell them, my child is too restless, doesn't attend classes. And in the class, the teacher constantly complains that my child is too restless. The counselor would say, what does your child do? Does your child only stick to studies always? But yes, that's what, because the kind of workload, the kind of pressure of studies, he cannot do anything else but studies always. And the counselor would say, allow the child to go out and play for at least an hour a day. Then only you will find that things will get to normal. That is what is important, that you require to spend that particular thanatic energy of yourself, which otherwise would come out as a pathological expression of restlessness. What is restlessness in the child is nothing but that particular thanatic state of condition, C is equal to F. If you allow the child to stay like that, at any moment the child might commit a painful infliction upon itself. So you require to spend its energy. Now, the thanatic, therefore, is a drive, is an energy that you require to spend. Now, this expenditure of the thanatic drive can take place. Again, I am reminding, before getting into the new version that I am referring to, that although I am calling it a thanatic energy, you are not in a position to make any difference between the erotic energy and the thanatic energy, because what gives you pain is also something that gives you pleasure. So that is why by inflicting pain upon another person, we gain pathological pleasure. By inflicting pain upon ourselves, we gain pathological pleasure. That is why when you expend this thanatic drive, you have to be very careful. Now, in normal states of condition, in natural states of condition, human beings have been spending this thanatic drive for eons, for down the ages, by different means. If you know a bit of structuralist anthropology, of Levi-Strauss, you will understand he is pointing out that human beings, by means of different kinds of ritual activities, have been spending their thanatic drives everlastingly. For example, in the Kali Puja, we Hindus in often, it is now becoming cliched now, but even a few years ago in the Kali Puja, we used to sacrifice goats and lambs in order to propitiate the god Kali. For example, when Agamemnon was in the Odyssean trilogy by Aeschylus was going to war against the Trojans, after he reaches Colchis, the wind stops. And for 1 month, the entire Greek side was stranded in Colchis, and they cannot cross the Aegean Sea because there were no steamships. And then God Apollo was consulted, and Apollo said that unless the virgin daughter of Agamemnon was sacrificed in order to propitiate the god Zeus, the winds will not move. And Agamemnon was reluctant to sacrifice his own daughter, but after a lot of persuasion, he decided to sacrifice the blood of his own virgin daughter Iphigenia, and in order to propitiate the gods. What is this particular myth all about? Doesn't it tell us about human sacrifice in order to propitiate gods? Doesn't Levi-Strauss speaks about human beings sacrificing animals to propitiate gods? Even in the 16th century, before the Spanish conquistadors took over the colonial rule of South America, you know of civilizations like the Mayans and the Aztecs sacrificing young children and killing young children, infants, spilling their bloods, their hearts, splitting their hearts open and sacrificing that particular blood in order to propitiate their sun god. They are tribals and they worship their natural god called sun. In the altar of the sun god, they sacrifice the blood of the infants. There had been cannibalism all around. So there had been multitudes of examples of human beings spending their thanatic drives under the mark of religion, so that this thanatic aggressive drive of theirs gets vindicated under the name of a religious code of conduct, so that nobody raises their eyebrows. What are you doing? You are becoming aggressive. You would say that we are propitiating the gods for that. There are other different interpretations of this, but I am simply trying to make you understand how we go about spending this thanatic drives. Otherwise, this thanatic drive would be simply pointed at ourselves, and we would kill ourselves. For the sake of self-preservation, we require to give primary importance to erotic drive and spend the thanatic drive. And human beings have been doing that upon animals, upon plants for ages, according to structuralist anthropology. Now, there is a twist. The twist is the degree of pleasure, again, the kind of degree of pleasure that we spoke whilst making a difference between pleasure principle and reality principle. I am going to repeat it once more in a different context now. Now, the degree of pleasure that you will derive by spending your thanatic drive or your violent aggressivity upon an animal is less than the degree of pleasure that you will gain if you spend this thanatic drive or your aggressive violent tendency upon a person of your own species. Could you understand what I said? Again, I am repeating. The amount of pleasure, the degree of pleasure that you derive by spending your violence upon an animal or a plant or somebody or something belonging to a non-human species will be less than the amount of pleasure that you will derive by inflicting pain upon a person of your own species. That is why you might have seen, almost in a levitous manner, almost in a joking manner, I might mention this, carping humor. Jodi dekhe thako, if you understand Bengali, I'm making it it's a Bengali comment. আমি মাঝে মধ্যেই দেখেছি বিভিন্ন জায়গায় মারপিট হচ্ছে, মারপিট না, ঝগড়াঝাটি হচ্ছে, কেউ সেখান দিয়ে যাচ্ছে, হয়তো সে ডিরেক্টলি ইনভলভ না সেই ঝগড়াতে, হঠাৎ বলে গেল, আরে দাদা হাত থাকতে মুখে কেন? I'm making this particular reference jokingly, but this is very significant. That means hat thakte mukhe kana, lay your hands upon that person. Go on. If you have your hands, if you can fight, you can lay violence upon the person. Go on doing that. Why are you banding words with the person? That is the tendency that all human beings have. That is why you see so much violence all around you. Human beings are basically aggressive. That is why we constantly try to maximize, like capitalists, we try to maximize our pleasure by inflicting the thanatic drive upon a person of our own species. Now, I come to yet another dilemma. This is the dilemma of human desire for species preservation. Human beings cannot live alone. That is why in one research done in the USA, it was found out that people who are alone or solitary and lonely, who do not live with their families or do not have their families, they suffer the most during the time of festivals and rituals, especially during the time of Christmas, during the time of Thanksgiving. They become violent and mad when they see other people uniting with each other. Just to give you one quotidian example from social life to make you understand that human beings cannot live alone. They have a gregarious instinct like animals. So we have already referred to two different kinds of instincts. One is an instinct of vociferous tendencies within us to divide ourselves, make the self and the other different. There is yet another tendency, a pregoic tendency, constantly working within us in a feigned deceptive manner in the form of a gregarious instinct to make all together, to live all together. That is called the desire for species preservation. Now, what is the dilemma? What is the stalemate that we have come to now? Let us see one by one. First, you require to jettison the thanatic drive from yourself, number one. Number two, how are you going to jettison or spend the thanatic drive? You can channelize it by a sublimatory manner, by playing, by spending your energies in different ways, but the amount of or the degree of pleasure that you receive from that is less than the degree of pleasure that you'd receive by inflicting pain upon another person. And if this person very much belongs to your own species, the better. If it belongs to another species, the lesser pleasure that you derive. Number two. Number three, third is, since you always wish to spend your thanatic drive for the sake of your self-preservation upon another person of your own species, you would require to do it. But then there is yet another gregarious instinct coming on your way, which tells us, no, you cannot live alone. You cannot kill or you cannot become violent upon a person of your own species. Otherwise, your desire for species preservation would be truncated, would be curbed, would be thwarted. So, what's the way out? You are in a state of an imbroglio. You are in a state of a fix now. You have to spend your thanatic drive, aggressive drive. It is best that you go on talking and doing plays, theaters and all that in spending thanatic drives, but that does not give you the maximum pleasure, the pleasure that you derive from laying hands upon another person. Remember, Freud said, love thy neighbor as thyself. How difficult it is now. Okay, but then you cannot derive pleasure by killing a person of your own species. Then what is the way out? Here is the way out. Listen to me carefully. Here the ego plays a very important and a very false role. I said the ego splits the self from the other, and I also said the ego plays a very interesting role of a falsifier. The id wishes to satisfy itself by spending the thanatic drive. The thanatic drive and the erotic drive are not different any longer, because out of inflicting pain you gain pleasure. So how can the erotic and the thanatic drive be different? Isn't it? It becomes pathologically intermingled together. So the id tells, come on, go and beat that particular person in the name of an enemy. Beat him, kill him in the name of he is your enemy. He does not belong to your species. This particular id can tell it. But then the superego says, the superego is an internalized proscription of all the laws of the civil code of conduct. The superego says, no, you cannot do that. What your id wants, you cannot do it, because all these people belong to your species. And the Bible teaches love thy neighbor as thyself, how you can go to kill these people. You cannot do that. As though Hitler did not kill multitudes of the Jews in a gas chamber, as though the Christians had not killed, in the name of religion in the medieval crusades, thousands and thousands of infidels, as though nothing of that sort had ever happened in the universe. I am not referring to our present country because it might turn volatile, but I have multiple examples of the same thing happening in our country. It is better to remain alienated and detached like Brecht. Okay, so that particular desire for species preservation will not allow your thanatic drive to be spent upon a person of another kind. But the id wants to do that. The superego prescribes it. There is a conflict between the id and the superego. Now, the ego comes out as a psychic faculty and comes and tells to your ears, to my ears, to saying, Debashis, believe me, that particular person in section B, suppose I belong to section A, that particular person in section B does not belong to your species. He is a black person. He is actually a Christian. He is a woman. Could you understand? Then I start believing, yes, 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 he belongs to B, section B, and all section B people, all people, or all persons of group B does not belong to my species, does not belong to my species. My species is group A. So this particular division, which is actually a deceptive division, the ego constantly feeds us with. This is how the notion of religionism works. This is how the notion of racism works. This is how the notion of jingoistic nationalism works. This is how the notion of patriarchalism works. The notion of gender divide works. This is how the notion of casteism in India works. Always creating a notion within the human species, a subdivision which is less specific than the human beings, which is a falsification taking place for the convenience of ethically and conscientiously trusting or inflicting our thanatic drive upon the other. Could you get it, what I meant? So in this way, you are satisfying your desire for species preservation because all persons within the group A is your species. So naturally, your desire for species preservation is supported, is fulfilled. But at the same time, your desire of gaining maximum satisfaction by spending your thanatic drive upon a person of your own species is also satisfied because the ego now makes a deceptive solution saying that all those people in group B does not belong to your species. So you thrust your violence upon that person. Now you understand how the notions of laws, different kinds of mythical laws in the form of racism, religionism, and different kinds of nationalism creates this particular divide between human beings in order to satisfy our libidinal desires. So the notion of the self and the other constantly works in terms of dialogue, and a dialogue which is a dynamic, which constantly works in the terms of a dialogic aporia. Constantly, you never know what kind of satisfaction that you're gaining from it. That is why human beings are basically aggressive. That is why you see so much violence all around you and less love. But that does not gainsay the fact that religion has the power to build or construct your eros in a different way. It has it, but it can actually benefit you only and only if you remain cautious about using religion in order to serve your political interests. If you don't do that, then only religion has the power to sublimate this thanatic and erotic drive to a particular way in which you do not require to harm the world around you. I think I have to stop here. It can continue everlastingly. It is almost more than an hour. It is more that if you have any questions, if you want to interact through that, more and more things might come out. I might not be speaking further now. I stop here. Yes, over to Professor Chaudhary.
That was wonderful, sir.
That was wonderful, sir. The way
Explicitly bring home something that even senior professors find it difficult to address in classrooms. I mean, sir, to use a bit of non-formal language, hats off to you, sir.
I have been teaching for 30 years now. Shubhita knows that.
Sir, Professor Dhar, we would like to start with your comments, please, and then take over.
First of all, I'll start off informally. And I would like to say, first of all, that Debashis, you've just made yourself dozens of fans in the last 1 hour. So congratulations on an amazing lecture. This was full of erudition, full of interest amongst students, and something that we all learned a great deal from. I'm sure there would be questions from the audience. And as usual, as you know, it takes a bit of time for people to get over the initial hesitation and shyness to ask questions. But Professor Rochaudhary, would you invite questions from our audience here?
Yeah, we have a question already. There's a guest who has raised her hand, Rupsha Roy. Could you please ask?
Yes, please address me as a professor because sir has been my teacher, is my teacher. So my question to sir is, it comes from the point when you're...
Can you be a little louder, please?
Okay. So my question comes when sir was comparing the pre-egoic state with Coleridge's definition of primary imagination as the echo of the infinite I am within the finite. So I want to ask you about a macabre section of the Indian spiritualists, that is the Aghoris. The Aghoris believe that like all of our souls are Shiva, that is perfect, but we are covered with different kinds of bonds, mahapashas, and to get rid of them, they practice all sorts of things like eating human flesh to practicing all sorts of sexual rituals and everything. And they do not, deliberately do not subscribe to any social norms. So I want to ask that, do you think that the idea that you were explaining, that we often, when we grow up, try to sublimate our libidinal energy by doing things that is allowed in the society, do you think the auguries actually rebel against that by doing everything that society doesn't allow them? Is it their way of going to the pre-egoic state? And is it what they call moksha? So that's my question.
See, it depends upon the kind of history of this particular community of people called the Aghoris. You require to get back to understanding the anthropological trajectory of how these particular Aghoris had been behaving or what is their cultural heritage. You will find that at any one point of time, the mainstream social condition in India might have had created a sort of a traumatic effect upon these Aghori people. Down the line, it is bound to happen. That means, say, for example, the tribal people of India, the marginalized people, the indigenous people of India, were not the part of the mainstream Hinduized culture. They have had their own particular kinds of life. Now, once Hinduized culture had become the mainstream source of legal conduct, or better to say laws in the country, it creates a notion of the Zizekian other. As I was telling you, the big other was constructed in a particular manner. Now, that big other is something that into which you do not belong to. You do not desire to belong to that particular big other because that big other does not recognize your cultural nuances, because the big other has a different cultural vocation altogether. Since it does not recognize you, you grow a sort of an egotistic sense of a divide within yourself between the self and the big other, so that you always want to create an other of the other, which is called the dismantling of the big other or the disintegration of the big other. You always wish to disintegrate the big other and create an otherization of the big other. That is why, if you look at the Aghori history, I don't know in details, you might be knowing it better. There must be something somewhere in the entire trajectory of the development of the community of the Aghoris, the anthropological development of the Aghoris, a sort of a deflection from the notion of this Hinduized big other or the mainstream cultural formation in the country, which almost all the tribal people in India tries constantly to adjust but cannot. That is why they have a sort of a dissatisfaction with the notion of this big other, and they constantly tries to create a notion of a otherization of the big other or a defense against this particular big other, which is almost like, say, if you have read Beloved by Toni Morrison. In Toni Morrison's Beloved, just one particular scene where Seth, the mother, kills his own child when he finds that the child is going to suffer from the same kind of slavery that the mother had negotiated for a long time in her own life. What does the mother do in order to save the child from slavery? What does the mother do? The mother kills its own child. What does this mean? Well, the big other is the slavery. And in order to repudiate this particular notion of the big other, which is tormenting me, I am creating my own defense at cocking a snook at the big other by killing my own child. Come on, big other. Now take my child. Can you do any harm to my child? It is a notion of a defense by self-annihilation that you are doing in order to criticize the traumatic action of the big other. You are otherizing the big other by a apparently self-annihilatory work. The Aghoris had been doing that if you look upon the anthropological history of the Aghoris for that matter. It is a constant otherization that they are trying to do. Of course, the ego plays a very important role over here. The ego is built up in such a manner that once the big other does not recognize their cultural nuances, the ego creates a definitive role and a very pathological role for that matter between the self and the other. But the entire self are the Aghori community's cultural nuances, secular nuances, religious nuances vis-a-vis the Hinduized, or better to say, the state's notion of nuances. Of course, you might have an umbrage to the fact that it is a Hindu nation. You might take it to be a secular nation. At least till now, it has not become entirely a Hinduized nationalist state. From that particular condition, the Aghoris might be different. This is not only typical of the Aghoris. This is typical of or characteristic of many other different dispensations that you do not know about that are tribal indigenous peoples, different kinds of remote people living in different islands. For example, the people in Andamans, why they do not become civilized? We look upon them as eclectic, exotic creatures, and we put them into museums. Their pictures in museums. But their kind of life does not really feed into the kind of colonial structures. I would say colonial because even the Aryans, when they came to India, had not been a part of India. That does not mean that there had been always colonial people in the country. It might be so, it might not be so, but the very layers, the tiers of anthropological colonization, civilization after civilization, constantly moving from one to another, had been a long process of time. So, Rupsha, you have to actually find out the history of the Aghoris to understand how the ego works in order to otherize their temperaments.
Okay. So
I
ego
think you
was
have got
somewhere
your
in
answer.
the history. Their history.
Yes,
Okay.
the ego is there in the history. The ego was there constantly making their particular negotiations
Yes.
possible at the moment when it is working. It is there too. Yes.
Thank you very much.
Any other questions,
Yes.
observations, feelings from any other participant?
you can actually identify all that I had said with the kind of things, the kind of historical phenomena that you are seeing all around you nowadays. In the national politics, in the politics of the country, you can see the impressions of all that I have said. And your understanding will be a little easier now. Why are people behaving in that particular manner? Why is this passion? Why is this craze? This passion, this emotion is not persuasive. Longinus, for example, spoke about persuasive emotion in the creation of art, but that is convincing and persuasive emotion. But emotion or passion that becomes raw and which is triggered by the fanatic drive, raw emotions might create havoc, might be very ominous for the country. And you require always to, that is the requirement of art, that is the requirement of cultural artifacts. You require, like Longinus, you require to actually translate the raw emotions into an aesthetic, beautiful form so that you approximate reality, but at the same time, you are aggrandizing reality. It is the artist's responsibility not to imitate reality as it is. Otherwise, it would not be realistic, but it would be a sort of a danger to reality. Nobody wants to see what is happening all around you. It is your social responsibility as an artist, as students of art, to deliver something which is more constructive. That is why you require to create persuasive imitation of the raw passions all around you. Otherwise, the ego will play in a very false manner to vindicate your oppression upon the other. And you'll never know what trick religion is playing upon you. For example, when the partition of India took place in 1947, try to understand the kind of mayhem that was associated with it. What happened? Each and every murder in both the sides, each and every violence was associated with sexual assault upon women and rape of women. Now you understand how libidinal drives the notions of violence is. Examples are all in front of your eyes in history. Unless you understand the human psyche, well, you cannot make significance of this. Now, you can ask this question, is this entirely an individualistic drive, sir? No. Any individualistic drive can be shared with other people. The way you are thinking, the way your ego is working, is the way in which another person's ego belonging to your own group or belonging to another group is working. If he is your enemy, his ego is working in the same falsifying manner as your ego is working. That is why another very important branch of psychology is called ego psychology, which was propounded by Freud's another friend called Jung. Jung created the notion of the collective unconscious. It is an archetypal unconscious that we all have in mind. Even if you don't understand psychology, go back to your learning, Yeats's poetry, The Second Coming, the spiritus mundi he's referring to. And you must have read it in your honors class, The Second Coming. He refers to spiritus mundi. A big image of a sphinx is rising out of spiritus mundi, says Yeats. What is the spiritus mundi? What is this spiritus? This spiritus mundi is nothing but the Freudian notion or the Jungian notion of the collective unconscious, from where this particular image is coming out, which is shared not only by you, not only by Yeats in the end of the 19th century, but is also shared by a tribal person in America, a Hindu fanatic in India, or a Christian fanatic in the Middle Ages in Europe. Could you get it? This is the archetype of the collective unconscious working in terms of the same laws, the same particular psychic roles. So there was one point of time in the 1970s, till the end of the 1970s, when people, social scientists who were averse to the notion of psychoanalysis used to raise a finger at Lacan and said, did Lacan cure anybody? Which is actually a stigma they tried to label against Lacan. But that is not true. Now, the entire social scientists, the entire cohort of social scientists believe how Lacan is true. and how Lacan dispensed his cases. Lacan is not Foucault. Lacan is something, or better to say, Freud is something. Although there might be a lot of criticism against Freud, but something that I said today is some basic rudimentary ideas of psychology. Yes, any other suggestions? Questions? You want to know better?
Diptota, any observations in the chat box?
Yes, I believe Dr. Roy Chaudhary wants to ask a question. Yes, Amasi ma'am.
Yes.
Yes, Amasi ma'am.
Yes, just a minute, Debata. I'm just trying to get my settings correct here.
Sure.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much, sir, for that wonderful, enlightening lecture. I have a two-part question, really, and this is largely in service of our students. We are doing 1984 in some of our batches. And since you brought up collective unconscious, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how the collective unconscious is operating in a dystopian text like 1984, and if there is a connection between collective unconscious and the genre of dystopia itself.
The collective unconscious can work in an utopian text. The collective unconscious can work in a dystopian text. Neither the utopian nor the dystopian text actually conforms to the formulaic laws of the big other that is there in a particular time and in a particular space, in a particular nation. Okay, neither utopia conforms to it, nor the dystopia conforms to it. Utopian ideas apparently speak about constructing a new idea in a more constructive and a formative manner, but that does not mean that the dystopian ideas are completely reckless or, for that matter, more dangerous. Dystopian ideas do really speak about an otherization of the other. It is like that blue whale game. A few days, it was a blue whale game, the Russian game, that particular person who created that young boy from a psychology class. I'm forgetting the name of that dystopian game, where the young boy from a psychology class creates a particular game, and it was a sort of a question, it's a video game. Once you start playing it, you move slowly towards self-annihilation. After the 50th turn of the game, what was the name of the game? It was a blue whale game or something like that. After the 50th, 3 or 4 years ago, it became very popular among children, and there were many children, many young boys died by playing this game. On the 50th turn of the game, you die. It's a blue whale. Something like that. Yeah, it's a blue whale game.
Yes, it was blue.
So this is it's a dystopian game. Why? What happened to this boy? He was a Russian boy who belonged to a psychology class in a Russian institution. Now, because of some particular perversions, I used to say perversions, he was not capable of conforming to the code of conduct of the institution, but instead of giving him medical counseling or a particular ways of solving his problem, what did the institution do? The institution rusticated him. And after being rusticated, this boy was so intelligent that the big other, the Zakian big other, he understood, is not acknowledging him anymore. The big other had marginalized him, had thrown him out of the periphery, out of the belonging. So he wanted to create an other of the other. He wanted to create a dystopian other. That is the other of the other. He said, come on, why should I really try to conform myself to this big other which does not recognize me? I will have my own other. And that is how he creates the blue whale game. It's an unconscious desire for creating an other of the other, and constantly ropes in more and more population within his particular fold, and at the same time does a misservice to that particular other, showing to the other, come on, I have created my big other, which is taking a revenge against you. You are trying to sustain yourself. My big other is just doing the opposite of it, killing itself. That is the revenge that I am taking against the big other. The dystopian texts or dystopian artifacts are born out of this particular notion. This is happening everywhere, both utopian. Utopian is a sort of a more responsible way of trying to enter into or better the codes of conduct of the other in the process of perfecting it, whereas the dystopian is another way of perfection, but that perfection goes completely on the opposite direction of the big other. This disintegration of the big other is the greatest of the postmodern phenomena, which scholars now, post-Zizekian scholars, or even Zizek's friends would call post-civilization. The dystopian texts are known as not post-humanist, but post-civilization.
Thank you. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Sir,
Professor
thank you
Chaudhary.
for that answer. We have Rishmi Ghosh asking a question, which is a bit of an observation as well. She goes like this: I would like to ask a question about the ideological sublimation that Zizek says about his work in the aspect of mechanical reproduction of ideas in the contemporary scenario and marginalization of a community as LGBTQ+, also in the guise of acceptance. If Sir can please elaborate on this process.
That very Althusian notion of ideology gets structured within us in the form of a superego from a psychoanalytic point of view. What is your superegoic constraints, superegoic prescriptions? Can be a sort of there can be a split in it. There can be, when I said the superego is internalizing a particular code of conduct, particular notions, particular laws of a particular state or a particular structure, there can be different laws of a particular state. They can, just like different political parties have their different ideologies, but all conform to the constitutional laws of a state. So instead, in spite of not being averse to the state's laws, you can yet have different plurivocal ideas working, out of which you choose, just like the capitalists and or the rightists and the leftists, having two different kinds of ideologies, working simultaneously or juxtaposed together within one constitutional framework, without contravening the law of the nation or the law of the state. So you have actually two dimensions of the state laws being split, being looked upon from two different angles. So you assimilate the superegoic laws of the leftist from an Althusian point of view, and you start working in terms of that leftist laws, which is not the rightist laws. It can work. That too is a big other, but not that big other of the state, but within the state you have created yet another big other, and you have assimilated that particular big other. That is how that particular ideology of yours work in order to oppose the other secondary big other working in the form of the rightist laws, which might create a sort of a quarrel, a squabbling between the two particular factors without contravening the laws of the state, without being too coercive upon the states, which can fundamentally coexist together in a state of a dialectical condition, constantly debating among yourselves. And what was the second part of it, Devdatta? What was the second part of the question?
Yes,
this is the ecological part.
Right, sir. It was, the second part was a little bit about the marginalization of the LGBTQ plus community.
Yes.
The guise of acceptance.
Okay. The LGBTQ community does not really conform to, I'm not saying at the present, at least 10 years from now, they did not really conform to the laws of the state. But then the very notion of the state is an amorphous idea, because when I speak about the state in India, that state, the notion of the state is different from the state in America or the state in UK or an European country. In terms of their notions of liberalism, the state's laws might vary. So in one particular space and time, if the LGBTQ is not being accepted or acknowledged by the laws of the big other, the institution does not acknowledge it, then it is a marginal concept, which is constantly trying to enter into that big other. And if it cannot enter into the big other, it can do two things. As Professor Madhuchanda had pointed out, it can create a dystopian other for itself. It can create an otherization of the other, one. The second important thing that it can do is it can create a sort of a radical revolution in order to stand their claim, in order to vindicate their claim and make the particular state accede to their particular claim and acknowledge them as a part of the big other. These are the two things that they can do. Either create an otherization, or the other of the other, or allow the state to change or modify its laws in order to accept it. That is what had happened in terms of the juridical system in India, the Supreme Court accepting the system of homoeroticism in India after a lot of fight. The same thing happened in other cases, not only LGBTQ. The same thing had happened. Say, for example, what canonical sacraments had taken place in India in the 19th century, for example, when Ishwar Chandra Vidyashagar, think about what Ishwar Chandra Vidyashagar had done. When Ishwar Chandra Vidyashagar implemented the Widow Remarriage Act, or was catered to implementing the Widow Remarriage Act, the kind of fight against the big other that he had to fight. What fight he had to fight? He had to completely go against the mainstream Hinduized notion of the constraints of the big other, which could not accept the notion of widow remarriage. First of all, the better to say, the Shoti Daho was abrogated with the help of Ram Mohan Roy. That too was a big other. Shoti Daho was a big other before Ram Mohan Roy took upon himself the responsibility, and he had to go through a lot of pains having to do that. And after it was abrogated by means of law, he made the big other, the colonial law, accept or acknowledge his claim. He knew very well, but by not creating an other of the other, that he can simply move out of this particular state's condition. There is no way out in which a dystopian other can be created. We have to stay within the state, modify the state's law, and make this particular rule acceptable. That is why Raman Roy fought against the Shoti Daho Protha, the Shoti Daho laws, and made the state modify its laws and accept it. And immediately after that, what happened? The patriarchal Hindu Brahmins, the male people, suffered a great jolt. They were not prepared to accept this law. What was normal for the state to accept became dystopian for the male Brahmin Hindus. It became dystopian. So they have to create an other of the other. And they did create an other of the other. It is just the opposite. Now, I'm speaking about yet another different divide. See, what I'm saying is, once the Shoti Daho law was abrogated by the colonial government, the Hindu Brahmin males suffered a jolt. And they understood, we can't stay with this superegoic acceptance. We can't stay with this particular state. We require to create an other of the other. What other of the other, a dystopian legal system did they create? Do you know that? They started increasing the kind of torment that they were inflicting upon the widows. The widows were constrained into more trauma. That is their way of avenging the Shoti Daho abrogation law. They created a dystopian universe at that point of time. And because the Hindu Brahmins, especially the Hindu males, were doing that, it became a custom. Unless the widows were saved from the hands of these torment by Ishwar Chandra Vidyashagar. So Vidyashagar had to fight actually a customary dystopian law at that point of time, which is not even a big other. It was an other of an other that Ishwar Chandra Vidyashagar had to fight in order to legitimize the notion of widow remarriage. So amount of, see, each and every otherization is creating another otherization, which the 19th century Renaissance figures in Bengal and in India had to constantly fight. It is not only LGBTQ today. This, I'm just giving you canonical examples of from Indian history to make you understand how these notions of otherization constantly work within communities, within states, within factions. Perhaps you have got your answer.
Yes, certainly. I
Well,
hope
I
that
think, yes.
yes, Rashmi has certainly got her answer. And yes, Anu, thanks you, sir, for that wonderfully illuminating session. And do we have any other questions? Any other observations?
If you have, you can
I think
write me in the email and I will be giving you answers if I can. Okay.
Wonderful. How kind of you, sir. All right. Yes, sir. Rashmi says that she has understood and she thanks you. All right. If there are no other questions or observations, Shubhi, sir?
Well, I just want to add that, this has been a wonderful session and a very fascinating range of responses to a number of questions which really, covered a lot of territory. Something from very literary, social, cultural. So we have a range of questions, and as I said, a fascinating spread of responses from Professor Bandyopadhyay. And Destiny would naturally say, thank you so much. Destiny was Department of English, Sister Nivedita University, in case there's someone out there who hasn't heard of this acronym. But once again, I think it's time to wind up proceedings. And now I would like to quickly ask Professor Prabal Roy Chaudhary to step in at this moment. Professor Roy Chaudhary.
I believe sir might be facing some issues with the network.
Fine. Then I think we move on to the concluding part, which is the giving of the thanks. And Devdatta, would you please do the honors?
It would be an honor, sir. In fact, if I may say, Professor Bandyopadhyay, it was an absolute privilege to hear you speak on such difficult topics. And I say difficult topics because they are difficult, sir. They are certainly difficult for us to teach or for the students to understand as well. And to cover such a wide gamut and at such a short span of time, my goodness, I don't know how you did it, and with such illuminating examples and with your equations and examples, so it was really, really fascinating and wonderful. So I would echo Professor Dhaur's words when I say thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Devdatta. Thank you, Shubhita. Thank you, Professor Roy Chaudhary. And thanks to the entire SNU community who gave me the privilege to work on this virtual platform. I look forward to further interactions. I'm really grateful to you for giving me
Thank
this
you, sir.
opportunity.
It's just,
Thanks.
you're most welcome, sir. I just wanted to give a lot of thanks to our very own Chancellor, sir, Dr. Shotam Rai Chaudhary, our Honorable Vice Chancellor, without whom DESNU would not be what it is. DESNU is the Department of English, Sister Nivedita University. I would also like to share this moment to thank the respected registrar, sir, Professor Shumon Chatterjee. Now, I would like to thank Professor Dhaur. Professor Shubhi Dhaur, thank you so much for organizing this series. And, in this world where we hardly get to spend such quality time together, organizing such a wonderful series is really, really, it's fascinating. So thank you so much. I would also like to thank our head of the department, Professor Prabal Roy Chaudhary, and the entire team of DESNU. Thank you so much, everybody. Now, last but not the least, the participants. Without you, there would not have been this lecture. Thank you for taking this Saturday evening out of your rather busy schedules and hearing this wonderful lecture. Thank you, everybody. And thank you once again, sir. Have a nice evening. Take care.
Thanks. Thanks to all of you. Bye-bye.
Yes, sir.
Looking forward to getting you once again